Okay, the first thing we want to do is to pull your electricity, unhook the electricity, lock out, tag out your company's policy, electricity out of that box, compressed air out of that hookup there. So now we're going to raise the lid, and we're going to zoom in here and show how to pull the spring off of the lid. Just pull that out, and pull that off, and do the same thing on the other end. You pull the lid back, take some kind of prop board, sit on there just like that. Flat blade screwdriver. Slide it underneath there, board, pry it up, and just lift that up. We have to remove that overload because you're putting in a bigger motor. It requires larger amps to pull the load. So he's pulling the wires that goes to the motor he's pulling them off, so we've got to pull the motor out. Now the screws are removing the overload off of the contactor. With this furnished, you just reach in there, hook it over under the motor shaft, take any kind of bar, we're just using a bar clamp, and raise it up. Raise that up, pull the tube out, that you're pulling out. That's the difference in the height that is needed between the two motors. Okay, we're going to put the tube back on top of the motor mount, and that way the same bolts will work for the same job. What this does is it lowers the motor mount 1 inch. As you're putting the bolts in, get them all in, get the nuts on, but do not tighten them up yet. Okay, we have all the bolts on, but not tight. And next process is to put the inlet in place, and that way that we can move this to fit the inlet. So now we're going to put the shocks back on because we got to work inside. And all you got to do is put it on the ball, push it on. That's it. Just like that. Because now we have to work inside the hole and in the inlet hole to get the two together. Okay, you need to get your fan and motor centered this direction as close as you can. Check your distance in that wall there. Make sure that you're 3/8, ½ inch away from that wall approximately. Then you tighten up these 4 bolts just snug. Don't have to be real tight yet, but just snug them up to where it doesn't move. Okay, what I did is I was holding the inlet in place because I could feel with my fingers the inlet and the fan, and I was holding it as close as I could get it while the gentleman on the other side put the screw in to the top to hold it in place. Now we have to push the motor back to the proper distance, and then we can start to lock it down. Okay, when you're moving this motor that way, just take your hands and grab the fan and just ease it and just kind of rock it back and forth, up and down, left and right, just a little bit, because you got to make the bolts slide in the slots. And then once you get to that position, and then we'll snug up the bolts on the motor plate. Once we snug them up, then the inlet can be moved to make the final adjustment. Watch his fingers. He's feeling the gap between the fan and the inlet. He'll go all the way around. He's using his fingers as a gauge. It's quite easy to see how the inlet needs to be moved, and he's just taking the palm of his hand and bumping the inlet one way or the other, because it's in that, he's got one screw holding it in place, and he's trying to get it as close as he can before he starts putting the rest of the screws. This is how he feels around on this side, what it looks like. He's gauging the distance with his fingers to determine. Then if he needs to move it, he just takes the palm of his hand and bump it just a little bit to center it up as close as he can before he starts putting the screws in. When you put in the second screw, it may move the inlet. So you want to feel it again. He's backing it out, he's feeling it. He's making a slight adjustment. Tighten it back up. You just have to keep playing with it like that until you get it tight. Okay, the motor amp, it'll say FL amp, FLA, or motor amps, depending on what brand of motor it is, will declare how many amps that is. That is what you set this on +1. If the motor says it is 4.5, then you set this at 5.5. In through the conduit fitting, get it all pushed in there. Push your conduit into the fitting. He's pushing that into there. Now that will be, you got to push hard. That conduit's got to push hard into that fitting in order to lock it into that stem, and then tighten it up, and that'll hold that liquid tight conduit in there. Before your overload goes in, put your ground wire into your ground lug, and that way it's a lot easier because you're not working around your overload. You're good and tight, and then we start putting the wires onto the overload. As he's putting that wire into the second hole, we go black, red, yellow. One of the interesting tools that we have found are these 10 or 12 inch forceps. We call them forceps. We buy at Harbor Freight. It's so handy at putting in wires. Holds it in place, locks onto the wire. Always make sure you grab your wire and pull it down to make sure that you're in secure. These wires have got to be tight. Loose wires Loose connections produces heat. Okay, now we're going to hook up the 95-96 wire into 95-96. The wires are labeled, and so you hook up 95 into 95 and 96 into 96, and that should complete the changeover.